The ABC's business editor Peter Ryan joins me now. Peter, a tough day for those in the newspaper industry, but a day that was coming.
A day that Fairfax obviously realised that they couldn't put off any longer. Fairfax have been staring the future for the last 5 maybe to 10 years about the decline of the newspaper industry and seeing what's been happening around the world, particularly in the United States. They've seen the future and they've made a very tough and hard decision today to make sure that they remain viable.
Just describe for us what's happened to the Fairfax share price over the last 5 years.
Well, around about this time last year, Fairfax shares were around about $1.30, $1.35 a share. Today, up 4 cents a share to 65 cents a share. So the value of the company has just halved over the last year, but the decline has been long term.
Yeah, even further back now was like around up to like $5 a share at one stage.
That's correct,
yeah.
and this is simply because investors have been extremely concerned about the long-term viability of the traditional printing business, and so Fairfax has jumped ahead. They're embracing firewalls, embracing the digital age, embracing the acceptance that a lot of people, particularly those who are coming up as in followers of news, want their news digitally. Yep. And it's actually quite amazing to think that an outfit like Fairfax, the Fairfax dynasty, within 2 years will no longer have major printing presses in Sydney and Melbourne.
And they're huge operations, aren't they? You can see that one at Tullamarine near Melbourne when you go out to the airport there on the right-hand side with the Age banner proudly flying from the top.
Well, that's correct. And this shows how rapidly things have moved. It was only those presses at Tullamarine were only built within the last 10 years. Yep. And before that, they were printed on site at the Age headquarters in Spencer Street in Melbourne. And Fairfax invested a lot of money, obviously hoping that traditional printed newspapers would be maintained. So
is that an indication of how out of touch Fairfax was? That's how some people see it anyway. There's been a bit of criticism of Fairfax over the years, and Australian media generally saying it hasn't moved with the times towards the digital production.
Well, ever since the internet really came on board, newspapers, traditional newspapers, TV stations, public broadcasters, including the ABC and the BBC, did initially see the internet as a bit of a bolt-on to their publications. But of course, for public broadcasters, they weren't concerned about the advertising revenue, and of course there'll be a lot of people around who would remember the absolutely huge Ages and Sydney Morning Heralds that would drop on your doorstep on Saturday mornings. Fairfax could afford to take a loss Monday to Friday on their newspapers because they would make so much money in the Saturday editions.
And people love those weekend newspapers. Are we still going to be getting those weekend newspapers in 5 years' time?
Well, it's hard to see that that could be certain at all, particularly if you're closing down your 2 major printing presses. There may be some other deal in the works. It has been said over the last few years that Fairfax and News Limited had been negotiating or talking about possibly sharing printing facilities. But once again, News Limited and Fairfax getting into a printing bed, so to speak, together highlights the pressures that newspapers have been under in recent years.
Do you understand the rationale behind going tabloid?
I think that for people who've travelled around the world would have noticed that the New York Times, the Washington Post, London newspapers had gone narrow sheet and in some cases compact. Most of us would call that tabloid. That has been the trend. There was a particularly big discussion with the Age in recent years as to whether or not it should move ahead and dump the traditional broadsheet format and go tabloid. Now it's been forced upon them.
Now, the key for Fairfax now is making this paywall work, because there are many people who think that in Australia, at least, the paywall may not work.
I think in the end, Joe, the big issue here is all about content and great journalism. Newspapers live and die on great journalism, and the challenge for Fairfax and other newspapers for that matter is being able to hire good journalists, be able to train good journalists from cadetships and traineeships upwards to create that journalism and to cover the big stories, to make people want to buy digital subscriptions.
But if they're cutting 380 to 400 journalists, how can they do that?
Well, of course, the unions are very concerned about what that means for the training, the hiring, the nurturing of staff. And even if you just look at newspapers over the last 10 years, The Age in Melbourne had a very big investigative unit and broke many stories over the years. They now have a much smaller one. They still break stories, but that's the thing for all newspapers, all broadcasters, to be able to hire and keep the good talent.